Welcome back to my channel. This is GM Sprinkles here with another video. Those who subscribed to the last video, I would like to thank you all, especially due to the audio issues. Apparently my headphones and speakers didn't pick up that audio issue until after it was uploaded, so I do apologize about that. However, let's get on to the main topic of how I created my first campaign. This video, part 1 of a 3-part video, where the first one is how I created my first campaign, my second was what I learned from my first campaign, and the third one will be advice for creating my campaign and what I do now. After creating my campaign, for the longest time, I always thought it was such a failure, as I felt like it wasn't really good enough. However, I have come to the realization that it is fine, and it was such a great learning experience, and now it has made me so much better at writing campaigns. If anybody's on the fence about creating a campaign, you're not really sure where to start, just have a go and try your best, because at the end of the day, if you've got a good group of people, they're just going to enjoy playing something that you love, and if you're loving it, then they're going to feed off that love. You will notice that I'm saying creating a campaign rather than writing, and that's because, in my opinion, writing a campaign isn't quite right. It's creating a campaign. You're creating a world, you're creating people, you're creating lives, you're creating a story, which is very different to writing a story or writing a novel. As we're taught at school, well at least I was, is that a story has an introduction, a main body, and a conclusion. And this is exactly what a campaign may or may not have. Sometimes a conclusion will not be what you envision. Sometimes the main body will be something completely different, because at the end of the day, you are going to be controlled by your players. Alright, let's get on to the topic here. So first, before I started even thinking about creating my campaign, I had to decide whether I wanted to create my own world or use an established world. 100% I immediately picked create my own world, because honestly, I love world building, and that's just me. And if you want to use an established world, there's nothing wrong with that. There seems to be a bit of a stigma on using an existing world for some reason, and I do hear sometimes people say that you're not as creative if you use an existing world, or it's not really world building at all, but that's rubbish. Honestly, you're going to put your own spin on anything you create, even if it is just putting life into an NPC, you're going to put your own spin on it. Even if you're running from a book and you're using it word for word, you're still going to put your own spin on NPCs, and you're going to make that world yours. Next part, I had to decide on what I wanted to focus on as a part of my campaign. Now, I chose a pretty simplistic story with a cliche plot. So the story was that the heroes were in a world and all of a sudden was invaded by demons, and they were the only ones who had the knowledge and the power to stop them. Pretty generic plot, but it worked, and it became way more complicated the more I fleshed the world out. After deciding on my focus and working out my plot, I decided to expand on the world, and I started with religions. So I created my religions of my world, and I tied that into the plot. So all the religions had this background and belief that they had always been fighting this ongoing war since the beginning of time with the demons. This tiny little bit of lore really made my world come to life, and it gave this fiction of the demons feel real, and when they did finally turn up, it wasn't unexpected, and it felt like a really good plot point. Once the religions were organized, the next part was mapping the world. Now myself, I'm not very artistically inclined, so I decided to use RPG Maker, and if you're like me, and you're not very good at drawing by hand, I would suggest doing the same. It worked out quite well for me. It was highly recommended. Once I mapped out the world, I decided to plan every city, every town, every building in every town and the city, and this worked out to be an awful idea, and I will go into greater detail in my next video of what I learned from my first campaign, why, but you can probably guess. Once the map was created, it was time to make a scale, and I had no idea where to begin, so I decided to go to the Dungeon Master Guide or the DMG, which gave me a reference of a scale for a world map, which worked for the time being. However, it wasn't perfect, but while I was looking in the Dungeon Master Guide or the DMG, I did notice the faction section, and I decided I need to create some factions and work out how my villains worked. Now, this was the only thing I actually used out of the Dungeon Master Guide. I did mention this in my last video, but people do say you do need to use the Dungeon Master Guide before you can DM. I've ran many games before I even had a copy of the Dungeon Master Guide, and honestly, I didn't think there was much use to it. There was some helpful hints for sure, but there's a lot of extra rules and extra baggage that I just felt like wasn't really needed, and I wouldn't recommend going to it. Yes, it does help if you have it. Awesome, have a look at it. It will help you create your campaign, but I wouldn't say that it's a must. Once I had the factions organized, it was time to create some NPCs that were important and get their hierarchy organized. This wasn't really necessary, it turned out, because my players didn't really go for the intrigue of the factions, but I'll touch on that in my next video. Once I created the factions, I had to put them into the world, and I did this by creating a timeline. With a timeline, I spent hours and hours setting this up, working out all the events since the beginning of time. At the end of the day, this was probably a bit too much effort, but I'll touch on that as well in my next video. Once the factions and the timeline was all organised, it was time to work out who inhabited this world. So I decided to pick races that I enjoyed from the player's handbook, and I stayed with the Dragonborns, humans, the elves, as well as the dwarves. I also created the Scully, which are basically tieflings but more elemental magic based. The Scully were practically carbon copies of tieflings, just with a few minor changes and with the lore added in. Actually, all the races just had that lore change, obviously, as well, to fit into my world. But the reason I bring this up is because you don't really necessarily need to come up with a whole new stats, the whole new character. You can just use the existing races and just make them your own and tweak them to the way you need them for your world. Once that campaign creation process was done, it was time to get my players together and pitch the idea, which went quite well actually. After that, I decided to give them all bits of lore and secret information that only they would know depending on their race, background, and where they were from in the world. I will touch on this in my next video, but that worked really well to see the secrets that some knew about the world and others knew different secrets. After that was done, the next thing we did, and it was probably the most important thing, was we played the game and we had so much fun. At the end of the day, that's the most important thing, is to have fun. And honestly, if you have a good group of friends, they're going to help you and they're going to support you the whole way. And even if you do make a few imperfections, that's just how we learn. And the more mistakes you make, the better your next one's going to be. And that's just how we're going to get there. And you're going to keep going until you make the best campaign you can. That's just a really good lesson for life, really. Just keep persisting. These videos are a perfect example of that. My first video wasn't going to be perfect. This one here is still going to have some issues. But eventually I'm just going to learn and get better. And this is how you have to look at creating or just DMing in general. Thank you for watching the video. If you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe and share to show your appreciation. I also have a Twitter, which is @SprinksDM. I'm not really sure what I'm meant to be doing there, but I just post whatever I feel like. Sometimes it's memes, sometimes it's helpful information, sometimes it's unhelpful information. But mostly I just post what I'm doing in my games and what I'm playing or running.